Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation. When we talk about solar, most of us think of the traditional silicon-based photovoltaic cells that Jimmy Carter famously installed on the roof of the White House in 1977, and which have become a fixture on homes, businesses, and in large-scale solar farms. But the future of solar technology could make energy generation on almost any surface or window possible. My guest today is Aaron Bates, founder and CEO of Toledo Solar, a Perrysburg, Ohio maker of durable solar panels and solar glass using thin film photovoltaic technologies. The company has embraced Cadmium Telluride, which is referred in the industry as CadTel. It's a technology that supports building thinner photovoltaic cells and that works in films that can be laid onto glass and other surfaces. American-made solar technology is critical to energy independence, as supply chain issues and political tensions with China have led to an 18% increase in the cost of foreign solar panels. The U.S. installed 20.2 gigawatts of solar energy production in 2022. And the nation's current 142.3 gigawatts of solar capacity can power more than 25 million homes, according to a March 2023 Solar Energy Industries Association report. Toledo solar windows, which come with a 30-year warranty, promise to add more generation capacity to a building by extending the solar surface across more areas than the rooftop panels that we currently know. The combination of electricity generated by traditional panels, windows, and other thin film photovoltaics on buildings could make our built environment energy self-sufficient. But there are many questions about the pace at which the industry can grow, and we want to discuss the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act's solar incentives, which are now under debate as Republicans seek to roll them back in the debt ceiling confrontation. Let's explore the future of solar energy. You can learn more about Toledo Solar at toledo-solar.com. That's toledo-solar.com. Welcome to the show, Aaron. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. Toledo Solar is one of the it's the newest American solar maker, and you've rolled up a lot of technology and patents that have a long history. Tell us how the company came together in 2019.
Yeah, so we started the company in mid to late 2019. Officially, that's when we closed, if you will. But really, this company kind of dates back until really decades, right? First Solar, and the story of Toledo Solar and Willard and Kelsey, and really CadTel in general, was really started with First Solar, right? So, going back to the mid 90s, cadmium telluride was always used in laboratories. It's like the 1950s for photovoltaic research. But the University of Toledo, in partnership with a local glass company called Glass Tech, there was a guy named Harold McMaster that owned Glass Tech, and there was a researcher at the University of Toledo named Al Campan. At the time, he was a professor of physics there. They got together in like the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And they had this concept of, because this is Glass City, USA, right? And glass manufacturing is as ingrained in the DNA of this region as anything. Mm-hmm. They had this idea of just putting a semiconductor directly on glass, right? And doing so in a high speed, automated environment. And so Harold and Al got together and really did that, right? They sort of invented the industrialization of cadmium telluride for solar panels. And then that became a spin-out company, right? And Al decided to stay at the University of Toledo. He was academically pure. He's a great guy. In fact, he's our CTO. So I know this story pretty well. But they sort of got together and did that. And by the end of the 90s, early 2000s, that company had now grown. It was called Solar Cells Inc. And it's sort of grown, and investment capital came in. It was actually John Walton, the Walton family, that then invested a lot of capital to take this brand new technology and, this new solar company sort of to flight. And unfortunately, John Walton actually died in a plane crash at a very young age, not long after that had started. And the partner in that venture capital effort was a guy named Mike Ahern. And Mike Ahern then sort of had to go through, and again, Mike can tell his own story, but he took that company public as First Solar. So we know now today as First Solar. And this was in the early 2000s. So anyway, this was at the time, it was a new technology. Nobody heard about it. And there was a lot of, all of the things inherent to that. And that's really a First Solar story. So in 2008 or 9 or something, after First Solar went public and a lot of people cashed out, right, and retired, as one does. These are Toledo people, right? It was invented here and it was started here. I mean, to this day, First Solar manufactures, at this point in time, everything in the Western Hemisphere is here in Perrysburg, Ohio, or Toledo, Ohio, 5 miles or 6 miles away.
We never think that would be the case, but it's interesting that the industry is actually consolidating there. So you guys,
yeah, well, it's funny. There's only one. I mean, yeah, to your point. So the people that started the Solar Cells Inc. story, right, pre First Solar, that invented this methodology of manufacturing, they started, like the first CEO of First Solar, like they all got together and pooled some of their resources and said, hey, we know that we can do this again, right? From a technical perspective. And the solar industry in 2008, 2010, as we all know, was pretty crazy, right? In the United States. Every technology under the sun, was getting started. Venture capital funding was, if you had solar in your name, there was money that was being invested. It was pretty heady times, right? Mm-hmm. And they started a company called the Willard and Kelsey Solar Group. Willard and Kelsey being, 2 streets in Toledo where the founders of, sort of met. So anyway, and by 2012, when China there were guardrails in place, right? And Solyndra failed, and that China didn't just sort of declare sort of economic solar war on the United States. They did globally, right? Mm-hmm. And they really dominated the entire market, and they killed, eventually, as we all know the story, right? Over 100 domestic solar companies died, like almost overnight. And Willard and Kelsey Solar Group was one of them. The only company, really globally, not just here in the States, but the only company that really survived and thrived during that time was First Solar because of this methodology of manufacturing they have, which is cadmium telluride. And so there was no other company in the United States. So when 2017, 2018, I had left my private equity firm. I was a partner at a PE firm. Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of weird things, right? And that was the most recent before this weird thing, right? And I had sort of heard this story from some friends of mine at the University of Toledo, Dr. Compan being one of them, just people I sort of knew over time. And so they told me the story of solar. They told me the story of cadmium telluride at First Solar. Like I learned a lot. And they said, there's this company that used to exist that's just kind of on mothballs, if you will. And the market has turned now. Now it's 2017, 2018. It's not 2010, right? And it's owned by one person who was a local Toledo, Ohio person named Jim Apple. And so I was introduced to these people, and I heard the story. And the more I was not a solar person, right, by trade. I'd more think about markets and finance, right? It's just kind of my training, if you will. And the more I learned, I thought that's a very interesting technology. It's a very interesting story, right? And so the more I sort of went through this, I started calling folks that I knew in previous lives. Some people were engineers and finance folks, and just I kind of went through that effort. And I thought, there might be something here, right? There seems like the market, potentially is there. And, First Solar has a great technology and they're a great company, but they only service utility scale markets. That's kind of how we sort of started very organically, if you will.
So why is cadmium telluride technology the right choice for your company?
Can you that's a good question. Yeah, so to talk about CadTel for a minute. So CadTel, most Americans don't know this, unfortunately. Not just Ohioans, man, like Americans don't know this. So CadTel is manufactured all over the world. It's manufactured in Malaysia, Vietnam, India, and Perrysburg, Ohio. And that's all First Solar. Mm-hmm. For the last 20 some years, First Solar has only addressed the utility scale markets. In point of fact, last year in the United States, I think it was at least over 90% of all new utility scale solar was done on CadTel modules, which means it was done on First Solar modules. Mm-hmm. So people don't think about it, which is probably a good thing. But you turn on your lights, man, or the power that's powering this call right now, right, is generally, if the solar energy through the utility district is coming through CadTel modules, and it always has.
So how much more efficient is it than silicon? Is that the benefit primarily, that it generates more energy?
Yeah, there's actually several benefits. So there's conversion efficiency, which frankly is largely marketing, right? Say, oh, this is a 22% thing or 19%, Conversion efficiency very simply is just the theoretical conversion of 1,000 watts per meter squared, which is theoretically the maximum amount of power we can get out of our sun,
Mm-hmm.
and how much on surface area is potentially converted to electricity. What's really and then that's fine. It's, because CadTel is essentially as the same efficiency as silicon, more or less, right? But what's most important are several factors. One, CadTel has a spectral response, a band gap of the semiconductor, they call it, that almost perfectly aligns with our visible sun.
Okay.
Visible
So
sunlight.
you have greater coverage of the solar spectrum.
What it means, it means that CadTel sees sunlight. It basically is generating power before you even see the sun come up in the morning, and it goes all day long. So it basically uses more sunlight, if you will.
Okay.
That's called spectral response. That's not something that's necessarily captured in like a lamp that's flashing, that's telling you, it's perfect. Most lamps are perfectly aligned to silicon, right? Silicon, in contrast, has a very narrow band gap, meaning that it can be 20% efficient or something, but only in perfect conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to generate that much power during the day. The usable sunlight is less. The additional thing is that silicon generally degrades pretty fast. It also doesn't like heat. There's a reason why you have a fan on your laptop, right? The silicon semiconductor does not do well when it's warm. And that's called the thermal coefficient. So when you look at it from the utility world is always known, because these are huge solar fields that cost billions of dollars and are financed over 25, 30 years. They quickly learned in that industry 20 years ago that if we are not generating power consistently and maximizing the amount of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours per acre, right, then our investment is bad, right? And probably someone's going to end up getting sued, right? This is sort of the law of that jungle and how it worked out. And so the utility industry really came to rely on CadTel because it's just basically a better product, right? It's a faster payback period. It lasts longer, produces more power. It's a faster return on investment.
So, and is that faster return on investment largely a function of the fact that it's just generating more of the day?
That's exactly right. I mean, how do we pay for power, right? We pay in kilowatt hours and megawatt hours, right? Power over time. If you're creating more power faster, then you're basically getting more return on investment, faster return on investment, right?
So how does it compare environmentally? Is it less impactful in terms of carbon emissions and so forth? Make a car?
Yeah. And this is the part I like the most, right? Because, so to be clear, the reason why CadTel just wins in the utility markets, right? And wins in, Toledo Solar's job is to take this same, technology and take it to the non-utility markets and emerging markets. That's literally what we do, right? We don't service the utility markets because that would be insane, right? To try to, as a small company, compete with the guys right down the road, right? They're a great company. We have a good relationship with them. We use the same supply chain. Most of our employees came from First Solar because this is Toledo, Ohio. So to your point, if you look at why is CadTel better? Well, so how does it compete on traditionally an unlevel playing field with, say, Chinese manufactured solar panels, right? Well, so in solar, kind of the dirty secret is that, solar energy is not clean, generally speaking, the way it's manufactured, right? It's used, the amount of electricity required to make a silicon solar panel is extremely high.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a reason why the country of China brought online last year 49 new coal-fired power plants, which is more than the entire world took offline in the same period of time, right? Mm-hmm. And they can subsidize it. They decide who pays what for electricity, right? It's brute force economics.
So what's the percentage difference, for instance, in emissions related to producing?
It's massive. So CadTel modules have the lowest carbon footprint of any technology in solar. The only thing that, and I can follow up, and we've got this data. I just can't cite it at the moment, but I can send you the citations. This is work that's been done by the Department of Energy for decades, right? Mm-hmm. But CadTel has the lowest carbon footprint in solar, full stop. And it's not about one company. It's just the technology difference. CadTel manufacturing requires the lowest amount of labor and the lowest amount of electricity, two things that, China actually is very good at subsidizing, right? Mm-hmm. In any market. And so when we talk about, the environmental impacts of CadTel, I always like to kind of reference, there's a reason why it's cost effective, right, to manufacture anywhere, including the States, because that correlates directly to energy requirements, which of course translates to cost, right? Things that are very, very energy, take a lot of energy to make like batteries, for instance, generally have a pretty hard impact on the environment.
Yeah.
And the other thing about CadTel is that right now, I mean, the majority of we use glass more than anything. Our semiconductor in CadTel is 1/3 the thickness of a human hair. So when we say thin film, I mean really thin, right? Which means that we use recycled sources right now. I think in the industry, in excess of 60% of all of our raw materials are derived from recycled sources. And by 2030, it is projected in this industry, not just Toledo Solar, but in this industry, that number will be above 90. Because again, we recycle glass, use recycled glass, the semiconductor itself is recycled. So it's also pretty cool about CadTel is that it's cadmium and tellurium, right? These are the two elements that are alloyed together to make this molecule. So 30, 40 years ago, cadmium is a byproduct of the zinc. I think I always get them confused. It's zinc and copper mining industry. So 40 years ago, these byproducts, when companies are mining zinc or copper, right, would just throw tellurium.
Yeah, they were waste. They were waste.
Yeah, just a waste. Exactly. And so what's really cool, another thing about CadTel is that this is really the only industry in the world that uses these former byproducts. Instead of throwing them away, we're like, no, let's turn it into solar panels, right? So it's a pretty cool sort of green loop, if you will. It can always get better, and everybody works in this industry very hard to make it better. But compared to the other technologies in the marketplace, CadTel wins far away.
So you describe your products as being 100% made in America. Does that mean all the materials are sourced in America? And is that largely because of recyclability?
Well, so yeah, it's a couple of reasons, right? But yeah, it's 100%. So now that being said, I think we do have some suppliers. I mean, we're in Toledo, Ohio, which means Canada's 45 minutes north. I think we do have some secondary suppliers on like the semiconductor side that are Canadian companies. But generally, the biggest material used in our industry is glass. The second to that would be junction boxes, right? In terms of size, bulk, cost, right? The semiconductor itself is actually not very much of it, and the cost is actually pretty low relative to everything else. And all of those suppliers are within 180 miles of this plant. So like our junction boxes are made in Tennessee, right? They're injection molded there. They ship up here. I think that's the furthest away. All the glass we buy is either from manufacturing lines right down the street. I think the furthest plant we buy from on glass is in Ottawa, Illinois. But generally, yeah, that's just not us. That's CadTel in general. It's a completely different supply chain than, say, silicon solar panels. Okay. It's completely domestic, if you will.
So it's lighter, it's more durable, it's cheaper, it's domestically made. This points to an opportunity to use a lot more solar. So how much surface area are we not using right now that we could be addressing using CadTel panels? Do you have a sense of how more we can do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is look at the glass market in general, first and foremost. I mean, even with the amount of solar that we make, and not just CadTel, just globally, right? It's still a very small percentage of the amount of glass that we make as the Earth, right? As humans. And so if you just recently, the Department of Energy announced, we couldn't announce it, but they announced just, I think last week that Toledo Solar has been awarded $8.8 million of a grant.
I was going to ask you about
and this is for new technology, right? So this is not, some subsidy to make solar panels. We do that every day. This is about emerging technology. So what we did here at Toledo Solar is we invented transparent cadmium telluride for solar. What that means is that when I think of the surface area that we're not using to generate power, I don't just think about rooftops and the ground that we could be generating power from. Because in the future, right, the argument is going to be over land usage for generating energy versus growing food, right? We know, I mean, this is the future. And so we work on how do we do both? How can we create technologies that will still allow the Earth to not have battling over these difficult decisions we're going to face as humans, rather to space. And so by inventing sort of CadTel that's clear, it's transparent, that means that windows, right, become solar panels themselves. And that means every building has, windows. Your house has windows. Your car has glass.
Does it have to be a transparent surface, or could it also be the painted surface with a layer over it?
So it's difficult with a painted surface, just because for any solar technology, for a lot of reasons, it's just inherent to manufacturing. There have been some folks that are trying to sort of take silicon cells and sort of find ways to put them into the paint. Generally, in our type of manufacturing, wherever there is glass, whether it's transparent or not, you can make it solar glass, right? Not to say you have to, but it becomes anybody can do anything. It just gets very cost prohibitive, which means there's a lot of tech. I mean, we can all argue technology is like religion, right? Everybody's got it, everybody's right. The way we kind of look at things is if we can't deliver a technology to a market that's cost effective, then it's probably a great idea. It's just never going to see the light of day, and that doesn't help anybody, right? So we try to think about how we can incorporate these things into markets and products that are not that different than how the market already sort of uses these products, if you will.
This points to an environment where there will be a lot more generation going on at the edge of the network, just as we've seen in digital technology. Does that mean that Toledo needs to design products that also help the building owner or the customer in general manage that power and potentially sell it back to the grid?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And so when we talk about emerging markets, when we think about product development, so I just talked about, technology development, which is transparent, CAD-TEL, which we've been doing that for a little while now. But, what we're doing now in partnership with Department of Energy and University of Toledo and NREL, right, is not, inventing the technology actually is done, right? It's how do you take that product to market in a market that's never thought about solar power in, like, say, the architectural glass business, right? They're just, hey, it's windows, we need windows, put windows up. And to your point, they don't think solar, they don't know much about it. They don't know what to do if the entire outside skin of the building is generating a ton of voltage, right? Like it's not something that they generally think about when they're designing buildings.
No.
And so these are emerging market challenges, to your exact point. And so the short answer is absolutely. And that's something that
you just don't know how you're going to get there.
Well, we have product development folks that work. I mean, we actually recruit product development folks from all kinds of industries, including energy storage and other non-solar based practices, for exactly that reason, because it's not about, making it solar generating. That is kind of actually the easy part. The product development side is then what tools do we have to either manufacture? What companies do we partner with that are already in that space that, help to take those products to market? Because these markets are truly emerging. I mean, think about automotive, right? I mean, we are apparently going, which I think is a great thing. We're going combustion free by 2030 or 2035, right? Mm-hmm. The amount of, that decision's been made, and companies are already going that direction, which is a good thing. But think about the amount of engineering that has to be done. Battery companies that don't exist yet. We don't even have battery manufacturing capabilities to even meet that demand yet. The amount of stress on the grid to charge these cars is going to be pretty dynamic, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty cool. I mean, it's a pretty kind of moonshot sort of effort, right? Like we did in the 60s as Americans, right? And so I think it's a pretty cool thing, but there's a lot that has to be done in short order. And so when we think about this, like when we work with automotive companies on exactly what we're talking about now, it's okay, now we know that glass can generate power. How do we harvest that power, from the edge of that glass, and how do we put it into the right voltage that we need to then power the battery and such a trickle charge the battery when it's parked outside? It's much more design and electrical engineering, and then all of the sort of accoutrement that goes with that, as opposed to like, oh wow, it's a solar panel, right? That's the easy part, right?
Well, you are a master of understatement to say that we have a lot to do. I want to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. And we are back to talk more with Toledo Solar CEO Aaron Bates. So with this ubiquitous solar generation becoming a possibility, what is the role of batteries, as you were just talking about, in the new grid? And do you feel like we're overly pessimistic or overly optimistic with regard to our ability to meet the demand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the energy storage business, and again, just speaking from somebody that's in the, renewable energy or just in the energy space, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that it's been a technological hurdle. It's sort of the weak link in the technology chain. And that is not a new statement, right? There's a lot of technologies right now in energy storage, whether you're talking about flow batteries that have a lot of good benefits to the world, environmentally and otherwise, and cost and et cetera. Some of the limitations from a technical perspective are like they don't discharge energy very quickly. They don't charge very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. Lithium ion charges very quickly and discharges very, very quickly, right? Lithium phosphate does the same thing. There's a huge environmental cost on those technologies that nobody wants to talk about. We like to kind of outsource our problems, as Americans, right? Whether it's textiles when I was a kid and we all kind of sold out, There's a million ways that we just kind of do this now with batteries. But fundamentally, I mean, the technologies of like lithium, for instance, it's a great battery. It's come down in cost a ton. It's being adopted more and more. still has a huge environmental problem. And on top of that, technologically speaking, dendrite formation is a problem. Like, it's very difficult to get those things to last longer than, say, 8 to 10 years, especially in temperature environments that are not ideal. Right.
Could cadmium telluride be a storage medium as well as silicon is in solid state batteries?
Yeah, I mean, that's above my pay grade. I'm sure that Al, or our CTO and his team, or the actual physicists here, probably have done a lot of work in that regard. I think that at a high level, I think that I am optimistic that we will figure it out. Because, I mean, honestly, a lot of projects, just in solar projects that we're involved in as a company, some of our customers, non-utility, they're building, community solar areas where literally they're pumping water up during the day and then they're having it fall at night, and that is their battery. And it's actually very environmentally friendly. Mm-hmm. It's quite cost effective, and it'll last a very, very long time. And it kind of works for them, but it also takes a lot of land, right? It's a lot of land, a lot of space to do this. So I do have faith in just being a human, right? Is generally we figure these things out. My personal sort of philosophy is, when the economics make sense, right? That is how, the future to the world surviving is going to have to be driven by, economic, drivers, right? It has to be cost effective, and it has to not hurt people, all of these sort of things that go along with it. And I believe that'll happen because the economics are there, right? Like, the demand is there, ergo we will solve for it. If there wasn't a demand for it in the marketplace, then, people sit around and don't get things done, right?
Well, we've done a lot in the last year and a half in the United States to try to accelerate this. You mentioned a moment ago that the $8.8 million that you've won from the Department of Energy through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act, the weirdly named but highly impactful sustainability or environmental bill that we passed. Mm-hmm. What do we need to do to encourage the development of the industry? I mean, as a country, what do you suggest? And are the IRA incentives sufficient, or is that just a down payment?
Yeah, it's a good question. Personally, I think the IRA was before it was the Inflation Reduction Act as it pertains to solar. It was the Ossoff bill in the Senate and the Krishnamurti bill in the House, right? Mm-hmm. As things do, they kind of get jammed together, and that's democracy, right? It's kind of messy, which is by design, right? And it's, I guess, a good thing.
It's human.
I'm a believer in democracy, right? So, yeah, that's kind of, I think the IRA was a good step in the right direction. I think, just my opinion, I think that the Biden administration and the Democrats that it was bipartisan to a large degree, but not as large as it should have been, unfortunately. So I think that, looking backwards on that, I think a lot of those folks still remembered what the Obama administration sort of was like, right? Like what went well and what didn't. And I think what they realized in hindsight is that, like, the Obama administration invested heavily in solar, as we all know, right? But I think in hindsight, what happened during that period of time is there were not proper trade guardrails put in place to protect that investment of taxpayer dollars, right? And so when you look at what's happening now, not just the IRA, even this week, right, you had a bipartisan, actually, Tim Scott in South Carolina and Sherrod Brown here in Ohio, are now pushing, Congress as a whole is pushing back on the Biden administration's decision about no new tariffs on solar, for instance.
Right.
And that is, I think, a good thing, right? Subjectively speaking, but I can make a pretty good argument that that's good for domestic policy, right? Especially if it's tax dollars that are funneling them, fueling a lot of this growth. So I think it's a down payment. I think that, we'll continue to see a lot of this streamlining. I kind of look at the Inflation Reduction Act as sort of what we like the Affordable Health Care Act. Mm-hmm. It's the law of the land, and it's going to change, and it's going to be evolving every year or every 2 years. And I think that's generally going to be a good thing. Right?
Well, right now, there's a debate regarding the debt ceiling about revoking some of the IRA incentives. What would you tell Congress if you had 5 minutes with them to explain why that is a good or a bad idea? What's your guidance? Should we do that?
Yeah, the debt ceiling is always a political football. Every couple of years, we know this happens, and it's whatever is the 5-minute clip they want to make it about that given time, right?
But if we were to revoke the IRA incentives that we've got in place now, would that be a fatal blow, or would it be?
Oh, it wouldn't be a fatal blow, but it would absolutely. Think about what's happened since the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Mm-hmm. First Solar announced another, $3 billion or something about, building more plants in the United States. Even Jinko Solar, which is a Chinese company, right, is building a like $5 billion plant here in Ohio to manufacture silicon modules. Hanwha Q Cells announced, $3 or $4 billion to build these plants in, I think it's Georgia, right? Think about how, the number of jobs that are going to manufacturing jobs. And by the way, the median average, in manufacturing of solar panels, the median salary here at Toledo Solar is about $100,000 a year. So it's a good paying job for a lot of people, right? First Solar, I think, is probably no different, right? These are good jobs. And so if you think about, what Congress, I think they do think about, I know Marcy Kaptur sure as hell does. I think Sherrod does as well. And I think maybe Tim Scott as well. It's not, people should think about the domestic energy market and energy independence first and foremost. Look at what's happened to Europe Germany did not want to start building coal-fired power plants. They just, there's a war going on and they had to make really hard decisions. Right. And this is coming down the pipe in renewables as well. It is critical to think about energy in the same sentence as we think about national security and, the quality of life. Right. It's not just it should be, but it's not just an environmental discussion. I think that in a good way, it's not just about, people don't want to believe in climate change. Fine. I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise. But the economics of energy and the independence of energy are really critical for everybody and everybody in this country and frankly the world, right?
Well, and solar has already eclipsed all other forms of generation in terms of its affordability.
Exactly. But grid parity hit in 2016. Yeah, to your point, that was grid parity, right?
Well, but also you talked about China's attack on the market. In 2012, they lowered prices by 75%. Do they still have that kind of potential pricing power? And is that why you think it might be a good idea to reimpose tariffs?
Yeah. So the way that they lowered pricing is China uses brute force economics, right? So when they subsidized the labor, for instance, as a country in a lot of different markets, and what they did in solar, when the cost of living got too high, even in China, to artificially suppress prices for labor, they just started using concentration camp labor. It's the Uyghur issue, right? Yep. They just decided to start locking people up and using them to make solar panels. And solar, by the way, the exports of solar to the country of China, it's about 7% of their GDP, right? This is not a small number. This is economic war. This is what it looks like. Same as using electricity. They don't care. Historically, if it's, coal-fired power plants or it's trash to be burned to, generate power, right? And that's not going to change. What I would say about pricing in solar, in my opinion, when you look at what that country did, and again, it's just taking a 10,000-foot view of the economics of it. You're not really going to be able to make silicon modules much cheaper. What you can do in solar in general, the costs are the costs. We all make things about us, it's like a car. You can only make things so much more cost effective. Now, what's important though is power output, right? So we all live in a world of watts, right? We sell watts. We don't sell solar panels here, right? And so it costs the same. Think about it this way. It costs the same amount of money to make a solar panel here at Toledo Solar, whether that panel is producing, in our case, 130 watts, because we make a smaller, kind of a footprint at 19% efficiency or whatever it is. But it takes the same amount of cost to make that panel, whether it's, 120 watts or 125 or 130 watts, right? And that's the same with silicon. So when you look at, the future, by 2025, 2026, the CadTel industry and panel, the panels we all make, is projected to be around 25 to 26% efficiency, right? So we're
moving along the same kind of track that Moore's law described with regard to computing efficiency.
Exactly right. And what's interesting about CadTel, not to kind of jump back to that one, every semiconductor in photovoltaics has what's called a Shockley-Quasar limit, which is the theoretical maximum efficiency of a single junction device, right? The Shockley-Quasar limit for single junction silicon-based, semiconductors for photovoltaics is estimated to be about 25%, which means that we're getting pretty close to the ceiling of that particular. And that's that's the elemental table. That's not that's not like an opinion, right?
Well, that's why it's a good idea to be investing in the next generation of technology.
And to your point with CadTel, Shockley-Quasar limit is estimated now about 32 to 33% for a single junction device. And now we're making tandem devices, and so it's a pretty high ceiling. And to your point, it's very difficult to manufacture silicon, right? Silicon panels in the United States without subsidy.
Mhm.
That is like, why did all of these companies decide to start investing in the United States? It's not because there's tariff to avoid tariffs, although maybe that will change. It's because that there is actually, for the first time in our history, incentive for people to make things here in the solar industry. But silicon, to be clear, in terms of cost, I mean, I don't know how much cheaper they could do it. I mean, China is really good at subsidizing everything and sort of artificially controlling a lot of price points. I mean, I think now when you see it shifting over to here, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, that's a pretty good indicator. Now, that being said, CadTel never needed subsidy in the first place, right? First Solar thrived over the last 25 years on an unlevel playing field. And everything I'm talking about now is when I say unlevel playing field, that's what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the CadTel business, we kind of look at the IRA saying, hey, that's great. And if you're going to be, if we're going to use federal tax dollars to, incentivize solar adoption, then it should be made here, kind of like the automotive industry, right? In the early 80s, Honda started building plants here in the United States. Yeah. And it was pretty rocky for a while, but now Honda employs more Americans than I think General Motors does, right?
Well,
so
and to,
I look at this as good things.
You pointed out Genco moving to Ohio, building that vast plant. That was largely the result of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, right? I mean, they were told you can't use slave labor anymore, or at least we're not going to buy them if you do. So they put a plant here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the Inflation Reduction Act, to be honest with you. But I
mean,
the
so
Uyghur Act,
the incentives in addition. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the Uyghur Act was passed and then started to be enforced last year. You had the Oxen Solar case with Commerce, right, where the Commerce Department found that they're circumventing, whether it's Uyghur or Build Back Better, BABA, right? Like they're, these tariffs and all of these policies we put in place, these trade guardrails we put in place, if we're not enforcing them, then what's the difference? Yeah. Now, what's interesting about that is that during that time, all of this argument about it came out of the woodwork, if you remember last year, right? That was, we're not going to hit our climate goals as a nation if we just stop buying, slave labor panels. And this was coming from the left too, man. I mean, this was really, really happening. And they were trying to shut down an independent federal agency from doing its job, right? It's always done it this way. Circumvention laws have been in trade policy and laws for 100 years here, man. Mm-hmm. But all of these voices started coming out. And what I tell folks is it's very important to remember that was very effective. But those trade groups that were pressing that message were lobbied by the Chinese government and those companies. Like, not to call out Genco Solar, but they were absolutely lobbying for that, kind of bullshit, right? And so the Inflation Reduction Act passed, in my opinion. It's just they looked at it and said, okay, great. We'll build a plant in Ohio because there's some money there, right? And again, like it's democracy. So like in my opinion, if as a taxpayer, if tax dollars are going to go to do that, then the least you can do is make sure we're employing Americans to make it, right? And I may not be happy about it, but it is what it is, right?
Well, now the other area where you have, I think, a really interesting opportunity is in the recycling, since so much of the material is already recycled. Are you putting together a recycling program? I know we're talking about panels that last 30 years. Are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so actually it's a good question. So in CadTel, and this is one of the many, many reasons, every story I'm telling you now is why did we start a solar company in 2019? Mm-hmm. When everybody thought it was insane to do so? It's for these exact reasons, right? So we at Toledo Solar, we're very fortunate in that we get to leverage a global supply chain that First Solar built over 25 years, right? Mm-hmm. And glass industry, all over the board. That includes recycling. In fact, CadTel being the highest recycled content as well as end-of-life recycling of any solar technology in the world. That's because First Solar built and their supply chain built CadTel recycling centers all over the globe. In fact, the largest one in the world is 5 minutes down the road from me. Mm-hmm. Because this Toledo, Ohio is the largest amount of solar manufacturing per capita outside of the country of China in the world. But it's all CadTel. So everything around here is really predicated on the glass industry, the CadTel industry, the recycling therein. So there's infrastructure is already there for CadTel. And I'd love to tell you that we did it, but we didn't, right? First Solar did that, a hell of a job doing that. And they continue to do a really good job of it globally, actually.
You're describing a regional economy, though. Are you also thinking about how to get the recycling collection capabilities all over the country so that when these panels start to age out, that they are being recaptured and the materials reused?
So CadTel, both First Solar and Toledo Solar being the only two manufacturers of CadTel modules in the world, right? Mm-hmm. We already have that program. They've had that program for 30 years. So basically the way it works, and it's pretty cool, right? So the warranty for our modules is an actual real warranty. Same with First Solar. So that means that the warranty follows the panel, not the owner. So if you sell your house, there's a number that's etched into the glass by a laser system, right? That has an ID code on everything. And so at the end of it's warranted for 30 years and it'll last a hell of a lot longer than that. But if at any time after that 30-year period of time, it doesn't matter who owns it, if they call that number in the future, then it's already this has already been the case in CadTel for decades, then it gets picked up and it gets shipped and it gets recycled generally here right now in Ohio. But, probably in the future, there'll be recycling plants in Nevada and maybe even California as well.
That's great to hear. I mean, it's good that we're building circular from the beginning, even if it is honestly, it's going to last decades. First Solar, yeah, CadTel's lifespan's at least 50 years generally, but we warranty to 30. It's the best. This is why we can warranty so well in this industry. It's technology. It's just the benefits of CadTel. So, but to your point, this recycling system has been set up for decades. And the reason for that is not just, obviously it's environmental and it's good. It's also the fact that it helps keep costs low. And like I said, anything that, keeps costs low generally means it's going to be, better for the environment from an energy perspective, right? So where can our listeners, because you've been very generous with your time and I don't want to keep you much longer, where can our listeners get a Toledo solar panel and how do they get it installed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, like I said, CadTel is the dominant technology in utility scale, but we're the only company right now that takes it to the non-utility markets. And so that means that a lot of installers or end users don't even know what CadTel is, right? Just like, I didn't even know that was a thing, right? In the utility world, everybody knows what First Solar and CadTel means, right? They know the benefits and it's sort of marketed and well understood. The math is the math. So what we do here when we started this company, we knew that our path to market strategy would have to be pretty unique, given that we generally don't sell through distribution, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
We sell directly generally to installers. So we've invested pretty heavily on inside sales engineering and support. And, like Gretchen here, so director of marketing, a lot of, market-based efforts, but that really is to help empower installers. And generally in the United States, 73% of non-utility installers are privately held. That means that these are not, companies that have a lot of support, if you will, not a lot of infrastructure support. They don't have a lot of engineers that are, designing up things for their end users and doing cost analysis. So we do a lot of that. But so basically, to answer your question, right now we have a network of installers in the United States we sell to that's always growing. The way it works is if it's an end user or a business owner, a lot of times they'll call our company. Mm-hmm. They'll talk to an inside salesperson here, an account manager, and they'll say, hey, give me your address and we'll give you for free. We'll let you know what CadTel, based on your weather data, right? What the estimated payback period and the benefit of CadTel, say in Bakersfield, California, is to silicon. And you pick a panel and we'll just do a comparison. We'll see. And if they say, hey, okay, great, but I don't have an installer. We say, great. We have an installer that's, 8 miles from you. And we've done a lot of that upfront work for them. It's free. And we're happy to connect you and we'll give them this proposal. And again, you're probably not going to buy directly from us, Mrs. Smith. But Saliva in northern, you'll contact Saliva, and we'll sort of streamline that a bit, right? So we try to do a little more
for a Toledo solar panel explicitly in order to begin that process, or because a lot of them depend on recommendations provided by a solar broker who is working to place panels and installation services. How do they? Yeah. Should they call it out?
Yeah, generally people do call it out, and the more they learn about it, the more they do. And quite frankly, this is one of the big benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act is the ITC tax credit now. There's only 2 companies right now domestically that provide a minimum of 40% domestic content. It's us and First Solar. And again, Mrs. Smith cannot buy a First Solar module. It doesn't matter if she asks for it. You can't put it on your roof. It just doesn't exist for them, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you call up First Solar right now and say, hey, I want to buy some modules. They'll say, good. Call us back in 6 years, and it's got to be utility scale, right? You can't put one of their modules on a roof. This is not designed to do that, right? The voltages are matched for the utility industry. You can't, it doesn't pass NEC fire code, right? So anyway, yeah, to your point, when there's this benefit, there's a lot of Americans now who are saying, hey, I want that additional tax credit. And they call an installer. Some installers don't know, some do. And that's our job to sort of try to, from a marketing perspective and support, to try to help fill that gap. But we have end users and business owners contacting our company every day, all the time.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I think there's a lot that people need to continue to learn and unpack about solar. But I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today, Aaron.
Yeah, Mitch, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time.
We've been speaking with Aaron Bates, founder and CEO of Toledo Solar, and you can learn more about Aaron and the company at toledo-solar.com. That's toledo-solar.com. You know, as computing has crept into every nook and cranny of our daily existence, energy generation is now permeating the human environment. It's disruptive technology, and we're seeing the social impact of that disruption in American politics and in China's economic war to dominate solar manufacturing globally. With all the environmental consequences that go with these conflicts, the longer we delay, the more damage we're doing to the world and to our climate. But if we can focus investment on a material like cadmium telluride, which is recycled at very high rates, as Aaron explained, we can achieve complete renewable energy self-sufficiency over the next 2 decades and do it without too much damage to the environment. There is a trade-off, and we're going to have to make it in order to get to an electrified life. The question is how fast we can get there, which is a matter of financing. It would be a disaster for the solar industry, though, as Aaron said, not a mortal one, if the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act are revoked in this year's debt ceiling fight. There is indeed a lot to be done in short order, and we're going to be following this story and the trail of solar power generation here on the show. I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or any of the more than 390 other interviews we produced on sustainability in your ear. Folks, if you would take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that will help everyone find us, and we will deeply appreciate your support. Let folks know that you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other purveyors of podcast goodness that you might prefer. Thanks very much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.